Just be fair there.
Hey, what's up?
Alright, cool. I mean, I don't know if someone saved the other wreck that was happening before or not. But we'll see. Let's reping this real quick. Apollo.
Yeah. So, Apollo, do you mind telling us what happened?
Continued after break. He was praying.
He was praying. Okay.
Alright, y'all can start whenever y'all ready.
Wait, give me like 1 minute before it starts. I'm gonna be here. Just give me like 1 minute, okay? Before he like gives a response. Yeah.
Alright. Mercury, keep us entertained, bro, because Archie's lagging.
So, yeah, I have a few pre-game questions for you, Apollo.
Oh shit! Wait, can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
I don't know why the fuck my PC glitched. Yo, Mercury, what's your favorite argument from DRV that you've heard?
From DRV?
Yeah.
Fuck is that? Oh, DRV, like the...
Yeah. I mean, as a professional on the subject, I mean, I can kind of give my insight on the topic at hand. Okay, so my favorite argument from DRV is probably one where he said that, you know.
Oh, damn, bro got removed from the stage, bro.
No, I mean that's a pretty good argument.
Who
I actually love that argument.
the fuck dropped me?
Yo, what's up, Corin? Anyways, Archie, I have a few pre-game questions for you.
Yo, what's up?
Yeah, so how do you think you're gonna do against Apollo in this like second half?
I think I'm gonna do absolutely terrible. He's probably gonna wipe me. I'm probably gonna have to train afterwards. Prepare for a rematch.
Okay, I see. What do you think is the best response Apollo has given during the first half of that debate?
I think when he said that I was like a monkey retard who like lives in Africa and that I'm not tracking, I think that was a pretty good response to my contentions.
I see. And would you say that if you win this, then you deserve to be, crowned the king of the hill of this server?
Yeah, kind of like the first generation Go, something like that, right?
That's
Oh,
right.
yeah, you guys doing this for Apollo's seat? He's
yeah,
one spot
sure.
above you.
Yeah,
Well, I mean,
want that
you have
seat.
it there, folks. And we have a lot of stakes here. I mean, seats are on the line.
Bro, just don't remind Mercury of what happened last time. Him and his group try to put all their seats on the line, bro.
It was not my group. I had nothing. I'd never debated. It was all them. They all lost, and then they just called it quits.
Wait, can the seat
Yeah, I
be
mean,
Gary's face?
Listen. That topic is kind of that's not allowed around here. Okay.
Yeah,
we
don't
talk
sore spot
about
around
the
here.
massacre of the British people. Okay, we don't talk about that, right? I mean, listen, I'm having flashbacks right now. I'm a murderer. I'm a mass murderer. I killed all of them.
You kind of like took your
Hey,
chainsaw
brother.
and like sliced off all their heads, kind of.
Hey, they're good guys sometimes, bro.
Sometimes.
Hey, someone just asked why she's on stage. Listen, bro. This is we need her, bro. Yeah.
I mean,
Stage just dies off without her.
My presence is very important here. Okay.
Yeah. Does anybody want to come up and give their predictions for the second half of this debate? I mean, just raise your hand.
Raise your hand.
If you have any, volunteers.
Ooh.
Oh, guys, I don't know who's gonna. I think Archie did pretty good. He's very rhetorically powerful. He was doing a lot, so I may have to give it up to Apollo because Apollo, he's the best debater. He can't lose a debate. That's like impossible. So I probably have to give it up to Apollo. He's really good. He's probably the best debater ever.
Right. I mean, you have it there. I mean, straight from the mouths of the citizens, of the people.
Yeah.
I think I'd take a similar view like that.
Is Apollo here, or is he?
He's
just praying, bro.
Now, he's a busy guy, so he can't always be here. He's very busy.
He's just.
Okay, I'm back. I won't be going again.
Hey there.
Yeah.
All right,
Good luck,
cool.
Apollo. You're the GOAT,
I had
man.
to buy something for my sister. Good. So let's go. Do you want us to just like restart the debate, or just clarify the propositions, or pick up from where we're starting? You let me know, man.
Yeah, we can pick up from like last time. So you said like what it means for like God to cause time is that like out of the set of all metaphysically possible worlds, there are some worlds where time exists, and in all of these worlds, God sustains it in some sort of way, or it depends
No,
on
that's
God.
not what it does.
And you just gotta calm down there.
I'm
So,
really calm.
for this, like,
I'm just clarifying your
you just gotta
incorrect
like be quiet for a
representation.
second. Yeah, let's just muzzle the dog, right? So,
Wait,
obviously, in this instance,
my bad, I forgot
this
I
isn't
was
really
supposed to
helping me. No, oh, if he didn't want to do talking stick, I'm fine with that as well.
Do you guys want to do talking stick still? Wait, let me unmute, bro. You want talking stick still, Apollo?
Well, he wasn't doing talking stick a while ago, so I don't know why I got muted. But if you want to do
I
talking
low-key
stick, you
forgot
can
I was
give your you
It's
can
'cause
give
I was
your you
speaking,
can give
that's
your
why.
response first,
Wait,
and then afterwards
I
I
just
give
want to
my
know if you still want
response.
to do talking stick.
I'm down.
All right, cool.
Okay, cool. So yeah, basically, right? Yeah, I don't know what worlds mean in this instance. Like when you say like something like God could have existed without time existing, and like time could have existed basically like without God. I don't know what it means to say time couldn't have existed like without God, like especially in this sort of sense. Like usually my idea of like causation is kind of restricted, even in a counterfactual sense, kind of like to temporal events or whatever. So maybe you'd have to like give me some explanation for that. Also, I don't know what you mean by world here. There's like a great confusion you had like previously, where you thought when I was asking by like the reading of world, you thought I was asking for the meaning of possibility. So I'm not asking for the modality. I'm just asking for the reading on what world means when you're saying this is a possible world, right? So let's say you have a possible X. I want to know what the X part means, not what the possible part means, okay? Also, I want to clarify, I'm not presupposing time exists in every possible scenario. You like claim that, I'm just not doing that. You also claim that I said God could have existed in a world where time doesn't exist. Again, I don't know the usage of world here, so I probably didn't say that, right? But yeah, that's obviously not my claim. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so the things that you've claimed that you claim was something which I've never said. I've never said that you agreed on the proposition that it is the case that time could have not existed without God existing, nor did I say that you agreed on the proposition that God could have existed without time existing. So that's another misrepresentation of the claims I've made this far in this conversation. Number one. Number two is simply that my definition of worlds is actually just going to be referential to state of affairs. So that which is a state of affair is that which is a world. This is how it's conventionally understood in philosophy and in modern logic. World is going to be identical to state of affairs. And if you want a specific reference for this definition, check Peter van den Wagen's book on metaphysics. That's how he defines the word worlds. Thirdly, you said you've never asked me about any sort of modality analysis, which is actually a claim which is preposterous, because you did in fact ask me what do I mean to say that time could have not existed without God existing. Well, clearly, of course, the main concept right there, which has to be clarified, would be could have not. Could have not is a modal phrase. It's a modal concept. So if that's the most crucial element of the proposition that you're unclear of, and you want clarity on that proposition, then clearly that's going to require clarification on that modal phrase or concept, which is going to go into modality analysis with respect to one's modal epistemology, or what type of possibility they're talking about, or what even is the term possibility and the semantical profile of such. Which, by the way, is irrelevant to the other questions you've asked with respect to what the world is and so forth. But even granting the fact that it is relevant, which of course it isn't, right? It still doesn't help your point, nor does it progress the sort of dialectic we're having in any meaningful way whatsoever for your questions to even be worth engaging with currently. So I'm going to ask you again, given the analysis I've just given, do you now understand what it means to say that God, or rather time rather, could have not existed without God existing, given the fact I've given the clarification on what it means for there to be a world, and what could have not be referencing given the context of this philosophical conversation?
No, I still don't know what that means. Well, at least I know what you mean by world, kind of. You just said it's like referential to a state of affairs. And you said like you take Peter and Van den Wagen's like reading of it. I know like he's like an actualist, which is just to say like he kind of just understands it to be like logical and linguistic devices. Like he doesn't actually think there's like something that's ontic and which refers to some sort of possible world. So if that's like your reading, I think I'm fine with that. And then furthermore, if you want to say that there are some like worlds like that are just cases in which I guess you understand like time to like depend on God, like in every kind of which time is there, it must depend on God. I guess no, I wouldn't like agree with something like that. That's like kind of silly. Because like earlier you said that you're referring to like logical possibility, and I don't think it's contradictory by any means to say like time exists like without God, right? That'd be a bit strange to claim as contradictory. So definitely not. I'm still not entirely sure that you answered the original question, but I think this is like fine to proceed.
Paul, you can go ahead, bro.
Yeah, what's up? So anyways, just to proceed with a couple of clarifying questions. One of the questions is going to be that if you believe that it is necessarily true that God exists, do you believe God is a necessary being, or do you believe God is contingent? Right. That's the first question, really, with respect to your analysis of God. Start with the background. First analysis is just going to be that specifically, like what do you mean, or rather, not even what do you mean by God, but what's the modal profile of God? God a necessary being, or is God a contingent being? Is it the case that the proposition that God exists is necessarily true, or is it just true in a contingent sense? It's like just a mere contingent fact. All right, that's going to be the first question that I have for you. The second question is going to be the actual point, or not even a question rather, but merely just a point I got to say to respond. So one of your responses you've made about the logical possibility point, and you've not seen any logical contradiction. Just to be clear on a couple of things, you're claiming there that there's no logical contradiction in time existing without God existing. But that's not going to be the type of thing which is required for you to be justified in believing that time is dependent on God. You could believe that time is dependent on God, and the sufficient justification for such is by merely establishing that God is necessary and time is contingent. Right? And so even if you have not showcased a formal contradiction in the proposition time exists without God existing, you can showcase that this would in fact be true, or rather it is not true to say that time could have existed without God existing, by merely establishing the propositions of the two. The first proposition being that God existing is necessarily true. The second proposition being that time existing is not necessarily true. And so, of course, given those two propositions, there would in fact be an asymmetric dependency relation given the analysis that we both shook hands on in the conversation. So the contradiction point is not really that relevant. And even then, even if you're not able to show a contradiction, or even if you have not seen a contradiction, that's fine. You can even derive something being logically necessary on the basis of some sort of epistemic claims or some epistemic reasoning, which concedes to the epistemic possibility of the conclusion being false. So I don't really think those responses, or that response in isolation, is really something which is pertinent to the point I was mentioning, or the question I was asking with respect to the parts of the propositions available. And I think the first set of propositions, or the first set of questions that I've asked you with respect to the modal profile of God existing, right, whether it is a necessary fact or a contingent fact, is a question which is very crucial to the conversation. And I think you really need to address that question, because of the fact that from that question onwards, or your response to that question, is going to make the conversation a lot more clear for us to understand your position on it.
Okay. I don't really know what all that was about, but okay, cool. So within like your first question, you actually asked like three. I'll like try to like get through all of them. So like when you said like you asked first if it was necessarily true, that God is not a proposition to be necessarily true. So I don't know what you mean. You also then clarified after, like, is it necessarily true that God exists? I don't know the reading of modality here when you say necessarily. I'll just like go through them. If you're saying like logically, I don't really think so. If you're saying metaphysically, I don't know how you're cashing out metaphysical modality. If you're saying epistemically, probably not. If you're saying physically, I don't think so. So maybe that answers your question. You also asked if he's like a necessary being or a contingent being. I'm not really too sure how you're cashing that out either, but more than not, probably not a necessary being. Okay, cool. So you're saying like, and then you just asked what's the modal profile of God, which is just the same question as the previous one, so presumably the same answer. You then asked after, does the proposition of God, is it necessarily true or is it contingent? I don't know if that's asking if it's like tautologous, which is just to say that like under like every valuation it's going to be true. If that's the case, well, the word God is not a proposition, so I don't know what you mean. I don't know what you mean does the proposition of God exist? I, I don't know if you're like asking, does the proposition exist? Or is the proposition, quote, God exist, unquote? I really don't. It's a really incoherent question, to be honest. But I'll like address the two interpretations. If you're asking about the first one, I don't know what it means for propositions to exist, so you'd have to walk me through that. And if it's the second one, God exist is not like a proposition, like just those two words. If you're saying, is the proposition God exist tautologous? Then like obviously not, because that could just be symbolized as a single proposition in which it's going to have like at least minimally two potential truth values being like false or true, which so obviously means in some cases it's going to be false. Like so there's logically possible cases in which it's false. So I don't know why you would even ask something as like retarded as that, but okay, cool. Questions aside. So you said that like that's not the type of thing required to believe it's dependent. Maybe I'll like walk you back through the modality you used. You said that you were talking about logical possibility. So when you say that there's some worlds where time exists, and in all of those worlds, God exists, and you're saying this is out of all the logically possible worlds in which time exists, right? I just read that as saying that in all logically possible worlds where time exists if and only if God sustains it. So in an instance in which time exists but God doesn't sustain it, if we accept the prior sentence to be true, that'd be contradictory, because we just said in any world where time exists, God sustains it. So I don't know how that's consistent on a view like yours. Now, you did say that you could also potentially reference metaphysical scopes or like physical scopes. I don't know how you possibly would cash that out in like a physical sense. I don't really know what you mean by metaphysical like scope, like as far as like modality goes. I know like some people read it out like under identity conditions, so they're just saying like, given it's like necessary, given the identity conditions or the nature that this obtains. Most of that is gibberish to me, so you'd probably also have to walk me through that, but yeah, I hope that clarifies. I'm also not really too sure on what the current point is. Like, presumably I've answered your questions on like what concerns like the kind of God I'm going for, so is there like anything else that's stopping you from replying to the argument, or maybe you could also answer that.
Wait, give me a second.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so just to address the couple of questions and the propositions that he's asserted, I'm going to start off with one of the questions being that she just believes it is incoherent, right? He's asking, what do I mean when I'm asking if it is going to be necessarily sure that God exists or something like that? It's pretty obvious. If you had any sort of basic rudimentary social skills, by the way, that of course I'm talking about the proposition being God exists. I'm not saying the proposition itself exists. I'm talking about, is the proposition God exists necessarily true? And of course, if you actually know that truth happiness is going to be a characteristic of propositions, then clearly this is going to be the case that given the context of the conversation, I was talking about that as a proposition. That's number one. Number two is, I don't know where you're straw manning my position and taking it out to be that I was classifying God in some sense to be a proposition. That's not something I'm saying. When I said that, is it the case that this is necessarily true? Specifically talking about the proposition God exists. And when I was talking about being, of course, like necessary being, contingent being, I was talking about the reference of that proposition, the subject rather of that proposition. Kind of just a clarification that I have to make for you specifically, because I know that you're really bad at tracking these sort of concepts. Now, to address the other part of what you're talking about, you keep on referring to the idea of it's not a tautology. Okay, you think that the tautology is an indispensable characteristic of something being like a necessary fact? That's idiotic, right? That's irrelevant, right? I'm asking you if this is a necessary fact. The proposition God exists is a necessary fact. You telling me that, oh, well, it's not tautological, so it is idiotic for me to ask that question, and so it is clearly not necessary, is retarded, right? There are plenty of necessary facts in zeroth order logic or first order logic or second order logic or third order logic going all the way up, which are necessarily facts, are necessarily true, and these things are not going to be the types of things which are tautological. Here's like one pretty obvious example. So if I say, for anything that exists, it is self-identical. That's not a tautology. You could have something which is self-identical, which is not going to be identical to the set of all things, or is going to be rather the set of all things, which is going to be self-identical. It has a larger cardinality than the set of all things that exist, assuming that you're not like a metaphysical holist, for example. And that proposition is necessarily true, even if it is the case that it is non-tautological, that would be like a theorem, for example. It's derivable strictly from the law of identity, but it is not the law of identity. So you telling me that it is not tautological would not be sufficient to justify the claim that it is non-necessary. So you tell me, well, it's not tautological, so it's obviously the case it's not necessary is retarded. That's a non sequitur, by the way. That doesn't follow from something being non-tautological that they are the types of things which are non-necessary because of theorems. Theorems in formal systems are going to be the types of things which are strictly derivable from the axioms of a given formal system, and it will still be the case that it possesses the same modal fucking profile, you dumb fucking retards. That's going to be a non sequitur right there. Now that you've acknowledged the sort of analysis are of what the world is, right? I'm going to just basically say that, well, you said that God is a contingent being, and so you believe that the argument you're going to be given here is not something which guarantees the necessity of God existing or the necessity of the truth value of that proposition being the case, right? So I'm going to just ask you clearly, is it going to be the case that you have a probabilistic argument for the proposition that God exists, which you said you're given like a psychophysical harmony argument, right? So you have like a probabilistic argument, sorry, for the proposition that God exists? And if so, what about the world which makes it the case that the conditional probability of God existing, given all the relevant data, is going to be higher than the conditional probability of God not existing? You can respond now.
This is gonna be boring. I mean, maybe you're like a retard. So I'm wondering like how should I approach this? Okay. So just listen, okay? When you're saying things like okay, when you're saying things like things like necessary truths, like, you know, mathematical statements, you know, things like that, things like essential truths, so like just in virtue of, you know, things, natures, or like theorems and stuff, like these are the kinds of sentences in which, yeah, they're symbolized as P, right? which might make it such that in some instances they could be like false, technically, like concerning like truth tables or whatever, but they're still necessarily true in some kind of way, right? So like take obviously something like 7 + 5 = 12 or something like that. Like sure, that could just, it's not going to be symbolized in any way such that it's like obvious to us. But obviously something like X exist is not this kind of statement for obvious fucking reasons. So if you're saying something like X exist is going to be, if you're asking if that's necessarily true, I don't see an obvious way that that can be necessarily true without being tautologous, right? I mean, presumably it's not going to be some metaphysically a priori or a posteriori truth. I'm assuming not, right? Like, I don't know what's to be known physically about something like that. Like it's not like the atomic number of like fucking gold or anything, right? Or like something like water. So I don't know. You probably you don't mean that. Obviously, you're not referring to some sort of rigid designation, right? Unless you're treating existence as some sort of like property that's like true of objects, in which obviously that's not how I'm using it here, right? Okay, let's go down the next one. Surely you're not referring to something that's like grounded in what something is, right? Because surely nothing about the way we've cashed out God here would even imply, right, that surely by the identity conditions of God that he would exist. So, okay, so that's like 0 for 3. Okay, let's maybe go for something else. Is it a mathematical truth? Well, I don't think X exist is a mathematical truth. Okay, so that's like 0 for 4. Okay, so maybe you'd have to offer more options in which that sentence could be true, independent of being tautologous, in which it's obviously not. Okay, cool. Just that nonsense aside, I think you said something about like my argument not being truth preserving or whatever. I don't know if you're like familiar with like psychophysical harmony arguments, especially like Brian Cutter's like rendition. I assumed you were personally, maybe not. It is a Bayesian argument, so yeah, it's not going to be talking about anything what's it called being necessarily the case such that the truth of the premises are guaranteeing the conclusion. No, we're just saying that like conditional on like psychophysical harmony or whatever, the particular kinds of configurations and relations between phenomenal states and like physical states, that it's like much more surprising on naturalism compared to theism, which is the project of the argument. If you're asking like, I think you asked for like what evidence or data that we'd see, well, it literally is just psychophysical harmony. It's just saying that when considering this fact, it just seems like a lot less surprising on our idea of theism compared to like naturalism. Now, if you want to know like how we get to this step, or if you want to know like what's being considered here, those would be much better questions but like presumably the evidence is in the name, right? That's the piece of data we're looking at to be like probability raising. Okay, cool. So like with those considerations aside, hopefully we can get into the Bayesian analysis. I don't care to keep arguing with you about like why your like inquisition about like logical facts or necessity is like useless to this combo.
Yeah, so you kind of spent a lot of time shadowboxing, to be honest, and they'll just explicate as to why that's the case. Well, just the first thing, really. So you talk about the idea of the Bayesian argument not being truth preserving, as if I've ever disagreed with this proposition. Like, clearly it is not, which is why I asked you for a probabilistic argument. But maybe you forgot that because, you have short-term memory loss, and that's understandable, right? I told you that what's going to be the argument, or what's going to be the relevant data, which raises the conditional probability of this prop over the negation, which is, of course, is going to be the psychophysical harmony data that you're referencing. But I wanted elaboration on that. That's not me making the claim that it is truth preserving. So you clarifying that it is not truth preserving, which is an explicit claim, which I've stated in this conversation. It's just you agreeing with me, which has no sort of relevancy. Like, okay, cool, we both agree. Like, what's your point of even highlighting the point you already conceded? And that makes no sense. That's retarded. So about the tautology stuff, you have not even addressed the blunder you've committed on the tautology point. The question was not about whether or not it is the case that it is necessarily true that X exists. The question was about whether or not it is the case that it is necessarily true that God exists, you dumb fuck. So that's going to be another irrelevant point, right? Of course, when you're going to have propositions like X exists or X does not exist, of course, that could be necessarily true, even if it is non-tautological, dependent on what specific object is the variable X is going to be representative of. Right? It can be necessarily true, but it's going to be contextualized. It's going to be dependent on what X is referencing. However, if we're going to be mentioning this sort of proposition, and it is going to be the type of thing, which is just like, let's say you put this in first order logic, for example, and you try to assess if it is the case that this thing is going to be, the type of thing which is in fact necessarily true. Of course, it is not going to be necessarily true just on the basis of the variables, which does not specify the objects, right? Of course not, because it is not tautological. However, in this conversation, we're specifying the variables. We're specifying what's being talked about there when I'm making an existential import claim. I'm specifying that we're talking about God here, but it seems as if you have like a very hard time to actually understand this very rudimentary concept yet again. So I was talking about God existing. The proposition God exists, would that be necessarily true? Or would that be something which is not necessarily true? You telling me that that proposition is not tautological is irrelevant. And I repeat, it is irrelevant to the fucking goddamn question, because the question is not about whether or not it is tautological. There are a plethora of truths which are necessarily true, which are non-tautological. In fact, I would say the vast majority of truths, perhaps, are going to be the types of things which are non-tautological. Think of all the theorems in mathematics. Think of even things such as synthetic a priori facts, like the proposition 2 + 2 = 4. That's going to be determined on the basis of the Peano axioms, which are going to be tautological in conjunct with the additional rule operator. And that's not going to be something which is tautological. You telling me that it follows from it being tautological that it is not necessary, and so my question was idiotic, in itself is fucking retarded. Now, last but not least, I'm going to just ask you specifically, why do you think it's going to be the case that the data that you're referencing here is going to be more likely under theism than atheism? What's going to be the justification or the evidence for that claim? And by the way, I don't want to hear any sort of claims such as it seems to be the case, it is more surprising, because I just don't share those same level of, phenomenological intuitions. I don't share those intuitions given that specific data. So give something which is a more rigorous form of argumentation for your claims for once in the conversation. You can speak now.
Let me unmute Archie, but let me say something real quick. Can y'all wrap up in like 15-ish minutes? Because I think the 2v2 is about to happen as well right after.
Yeah, I got you.
Great,
I mean, this is like really, really boring. Holy fuck. Like, I'm glad you spent like the last 5 minutes saying what I had said already, right? I already gave you examples. In fact, more examples than you just gave about sentences which could be necessarily true. Not just true, by the way, which is something you conflated, but necessarily true, but not tautologous. I'm aware of that. I just said that X exists is not the kind of sentence that fits into any of those categories. Doesn't rigidly designate, right? Not a necessary a priori truth, right? Not a mathematical theorem or truth, right? Okay, cool. Not a structuralist truth, right? Oh, okay. So I asked you to give me an example of which a sentence like that could be necessarily true without it being tautologous. You didn't. So I'm assuming either A, you didn't hear me, which I'm going to assume is the case since you repeated my responses and responded presumably to like 2 points prior, I believe, actually. Yeah, that's about 2 points prior. That's embarrassing. Or B, you just don't understand what the fuck you're talking about, right? So I'm not even going to take the time to think about which one is the actual answer. I'm just going to assume maybe it's both. Okay, cool. And then I'm just going to move on and respond to your next point. So if you're just asking like why we might expect it on like theism compared to naturalism, that's just mainly because it seems like out of the vast amount of like configurations that could have obtained given naturalism, it seems to be a far broader and wider scope comparatively to like theism, especially if we like stalking horse and like build in certain dispositions into God. It seems like we'd have some sort of reason to think that he'd want to realize the values of the kinds of sorts that are only that are only possible to obtain or emerge, given the fact that we have, harmonious like relations and structures. There's a lot of different ways that are, basically relations could have been like correlated, that our physical states and our phenomenal states could have been correlated, right? A lot more under naturalism comparatively to this iteration of theism. So thus, since we're reducing the possibility space in such a way, we want to actually say that you have a far higher chance of obtaining harmony under a view like this, like under a view like theism, comparatively to naturalism, right? I'm not too sure if you have a disagreement on that. I could like explain why that's the case if you want, but.
Are you done? Okay, cool. So just to respond to a couple of things. Yeah, I repeated one of the points you mentioned, and again, you repeated the point of case scenarios in which you have necessary facts which are not tautological goes against the original point of you saying that it is idiotic for me to ask you the question, which is it the case that God exists and is something which is necessarily true, given the fact that it is non-tautological? Then you said afterwards, it's obviously the type of thing which is non-necessary, given that it is not a tautology. That was retarded. And now you're actually agreeing with me. You're actually agreeing with me by even giving me examples to strengthen my point. Wonderful. So that's the first thing I want to just knock off the list. About the psychophysical harm in the data, you've not even explicated as to why it would actually be more likely. Like usually when someone is saying that something is more likely, they're going to first and foremost, I'm going to just teach you something because you're very new to this, right? They're going to hash out, they're going to start off with like a sort of like analysis of what determines the probability of the space, for example, what determines the probability of the space. Are going under some empirical account of probability, your frequentist account, an algorithmic account, whatever the fucking account is. Right? There are like plethora of accounts of probability in the field of probability there. Then after starting off with that, then they would explain why, given the data that they're appealing to specifically, it would in fact be the case that such proposition that's being attempted to be justified by a particular interlocutor is going to be something which is more likely than the latter proposition or the negation hypothesis. You missed out the first step because you're a fucking rookie debater who doesn't know anything about what you're talking about, which is actually hashing out the fucking probability theory. You've not hashed out the probability theory. And even worse, you've not even explicated out given any fucking probability theory. Your claim is going to be more likely, and the claim being to be very specific, God existed. You've not specified or explicated or elaborated as to why, given any of the fucking probability theory, this claim would be more likely than the negation hypothesis. If you're going to go under some Bayesian model, that's going to, of course, rely on some different degrees of prior distributions. You could basically appeal to maybe the principle of uniform distribution in Bayesianism, or if you don't want to grant that principle, you could basically unequally distribute priors to each propositions, which even then, that's going to be arbitrary if you're going to be distributing priors to either proposition to then give an extrapolation on which one is more likely. And if you want to say that you're going to appeal to the principle of uniform distribution, there's still nothing within the data or within your reasoning, whether it's an inductive reason or whatever, which proves to me that it would be the case that is more likely. So you're just failing on all facets possible. And not to mention, I could even give an argument even after you attempt to give justification for a claim as to why naturalism would actually expect this data just as much, if not even more, than theism, without even having to postulate some sort of like omnipotent. Well, you're not even defining God to be omnipotent. You're just saying God is like an agent which created this, that. But I can give like an argument, sorry, as to why naturalism is going to be something which equally, if not morally, expects the data in comparison to your version of theism, I should say. Right? I could even give an argument for that. But first, I'm going to give you another chance to give an argument for the theistic position. And then afterwards, if you fail again on giving such an argument, such a probabilistic argument that you attempt, or that you claim to have rather, then I'll just give an argument in support of the negation hypothesis and see how well it can actually tackle with the argument intellectually. You can give a response.
Yikes.
Just to remind,
Okay.
just a couple more like responses back and forth.
Yeah.
Probably have to
Yeah, I
switch.
got you. Yeah, damn, this guy's retarded. Okay. So I'm just gonna ignore like the nonsense that you said in the beginning. It's just like I'm really getting tired of communicating points to you and like expecting you to process them like a rational human. Okay, so I'm gonna ignore like the obvious dodges, and I'm just gonna address the second point because it was actually kind of interesting. I mean, just concerning like what's it called? Like I guess the prior analysis. I mean, we could just say like we could just go off of like conjugate priors. Like I don't know if you're like familiar with those kinds, but at least when we're talking about like indifference principles or distribution principles, I might just say that what's it called? Like I'm kind of just applying it such that we're just going off of like coordinated like priors. Like I don't know if you're familiar with those, so I might just say like it seems to appeal to like most people such that like the prior probability of like God isn't really that low, such that when we update on it, it's gonna like lose the race. If you hold like your priors that low, which I don't believe, you can like say that, and then we can like try to reconcile it through some way. Like we can talk like about why you think the priors are that low. I don't really mind, but usually that's like what unified distribution is referring to. If you're not referring to that, like how we measure our priors and whatnot, I don't really know what the fuck you're talking about then. But yeah. And then I guess like concerning what's it called, how it's gonna update, or I guess like once updating, why like theism would probably win over. Well, I think that's because when we talk about like the kinds of expectations that generally like both of the like hypotheses could like offer, theism, or sorry, not theism, but naturalism, like Bear, it doesn't generate any sort of like expectations of, you know, harmonious like connections, let alone the kinds of correlations that we typically see. Really, in fact, it doesn't generate any expectations for any kind of expectation, or sorry, for any kinds of experiences like that, right? So we can have a completely naturalistic world without that kind of thing. So I'm not really too sure why exactly we'd expect it, right? I mean, maybe you can build in expectations in which you probably just want to be talking about the same naturalistic hypothesis that Cutter's getting at, that he's trying to attack. But yeah, presumably, like naturalism Bear, there's like many different possibilities for other kinds of like occurrences to occur, such that, you know, maybe like the phenomenal states we, you know, happen to like have, maybe these kinds of phenomenal states are just things like ringing noises, or maybe things like, you know, gray neutral matter, or any kinds of things that are accompanied by this kind of physical experience, right? The point of the argument is to assess what you know, what's the exponendum, what kinds of harmony are we trying to explain, and then we're trying to see whether these hypotheses would greatly expect this, right? There's no reason to think naturalism Bear is going to generate any kind of expectation for normative harmony, right? And in the case that it, or at least not very, very great expectations, and in the case they do, maybe you could explain it to me, but that's not like really obvious. Now I could explain what a theistic hypothesis does. Like generally, like if we understand God to be some sort of being that's, I don't know, maybe like good or whatever, maybe like all knowing, which are the kind of like properties that Cutter's getting at in his paper. Presumably, if God is all good, and he does think like some behaviors are like good and bad, right? He'd want to realize values such that people can make good behaviors and can do good things, right? But usually that's going to be accompanied by experience. If we didn't have experience, especially the kinds of experiences that Cutter's getting at, then presumably we wouldn't even be able to process or like actually have evaluative judgments on these kinds of things, right? So it makes sense, and there'd be some sort of at least like normative desire and like reason to rationalize that kind of behavior, or sorry, some rationalization for that behavior of him not causing humans to be about or whatever, and whatever kind of reading you want to take cause under, and actually having these humans have these sorts of experiences, right? Such that they can do good actions and such that they could do these kinds of things, right? That's at least going to be expected better on this kind of thing because there are built-in expectations into the hypothesis such that he'd have reason to do this. For naturalism, we don't really see these kinds of same expectations, so that'd probably have to be what you address. I don't know how much time we have left, but you should probably just respond to that point particularly.
Yeah, so just to address a couple of things. Because you have like this nasty tendency to accuse your opponent of not addressing points even after your points got demolished and debunked. Now, with respect to what you're talking about there, the original definition you had for God did not even bake in the all-knowing or the good properties. So that's going to be something which is not even substantiating your actual definition of God, the way in which you defined it for this conversation, number one. Number two is simply a definition of God or a conceptual analysis of God, which does not invoke the omniscience property or the good property. It's going to be something which is the type of thing which is more parsimonious than the sort of conceptual analysis of God, which invokes these extra properties. So then you could basically, I could just ask for the argument as to why it would be the case that the parsimony benefits against this notion of God is going to be something which is outweighed by the built-in expectations which you think predicts the data, given that less parsimonious explanation of God. And that's going to be something which you can never actually justify, given the fact that you lack the relevant knowledge in probability theory and the philosophical reasoning. So I'm going to just basically assume you lost that point for the time being. Naturalism would in fact expect this. You telling me that it is in fact possible, or there are worlds in which you could have phenomenal states which do not actually, or which are not realized by these physical instantiations, right, is the type of thing which is irrelevant. Of course, it is possible under naturalism that this is true, but it is going to be something which is even ruled out evidentially by naturalism indexed to the actual world. Because we know in the actual world, selection theory is true. We know in the actual world, evolution theory is true. We know that the things given the evidence in biology points towards the idea that it is the case that we have survival instincts, and there's some sort of telos, some biological telos, which points towards us survival, or us wanting or attempting to survive. This is proven not just amongst human species, but amongst every biological species, rather. And under the naturalistic position, given the fact that evolution is true, it would be the case that lawful realization between the physical states and the phenomenal states would benefit our survival, since we use our mind to discover harm, and without physical realizations of such mental states, we would have a lower survival rate. So let's say, for example, I use my mind to discover the fact that, hey, there's a tiger or there's going to be a lion that's going to be approaching me to kill me basically in the woods or in whatever, or in the wild to be very specific. And of course, my mind has discovered that fact, which points towards it being the case that, hey, I'm in a state where my survival rate is really low right now, like I'm in harm right now, right? If it was to be the case that my physical states would not be something which realizes those phenomenal states for the sake of survival, that would be something which is less expected under the evolution theory, which is true even under a naturalistic hypothesis. In fact, you could say that this particular psychological harmony argument is something which is very expected, even more under the evolution theory, which is indexed to naturalism, than under theism being true, because even your position on theism is going to encapsulate evolution theory, because I'm pretty sure you're not retarded enough to deny evolution, right? So it's going to be the type of thing which is going to be a conjunct of both theism, which is going to be invoking a less parsimonious or an unparsimonious concept of God, which is going to be an all-knowing, all-good God or a good God, and evolution theory. Which, by the way, the first conjunct is not required to expect the data. You can just appeal to the second conjunct, and you'd equally expect, if not expect the data even more. So with that being said, I've given a more parsimonious explanation for the phenomena, which equally, if not more, expects or explain the data in comparison to your position. So you're kind of just fucked right now. You're like a double bind, whereas you're not able to really justify your point insofar as the probabilistic.
Right, we're about to conclude anyways, so we could I'll just cut you off
conclusions. Go for it.
Nonsense. So the idea is, I'll respond to this point, and then afterwards. That's so funny in chat. Okay, I'll respond to this point, and then we can conclude, because they're going to do the 2v2 soon. So, just listen. Maybe you don't understand how, evolution works, which is, fine. So, no evolutionary theory, right, says that it's better expected that we will have advantageous traits. No. What evolution is saying, right, is that given the fact certain organisms have these advantageous features, especially well accustomed to their environment, when they're going through certain selective pressures, these organisms are going to produce or reproduce in abundance such that their offspring also have those advantageous traits. And furthermore, they reproduce in abundance. And people with disadvantaged traits, or organisms with disadvantaged traits, obviously don't, right? Because they either just die off or they just don't reproduce as much, such that they eventually die off, okay? It speaks nothing about psychophysical connections. In fact, the fact that certain organisms even have these advantageous traits such that they have this conscious to physical mapping presupposes the normative or the psychophysical harmony. right? So in fact, evolution is quiet on psychophysical harmony. It doesn't give an account for it. No, it presupposes it. Idiot, right? You don't have to deny the psychophysical harmony account. Like Cutter, Swinburne, these people are not denying evolution, you fucking nugget. What they're doing, right, is they're saying, okay, even if we like accept evolution, that just presses the question back as to what explains the fact that any organism happened to have those advantageous traits, right? There could have been a world in which evolution still occurred, right? These beings still did, pass down certain advantageous traits and evolve over time, accustomed well with their environment, right? And it just happened that no organism actually got that mapping such that they all died off. So evolution still occurred. They just didn't have the right advantageous traits, right? Evolution cannot answer questions like that. It's quiet on questions like that, right? You'd have to do furthermore a meta-analysis in which you're asking furthermore philosophical questions. Evolutionary theory does not answer questions like that. You're a fucking idiot. But listen, it's fine. Like, I think we can like wrap it up to conclusions, because if you think like I didn't like account for anything before, like it doesn't matter to me. You're like kind of boring.
Well, he made some new points. I'm not gonna just go to conclusions, right? So just to address the new points you mentioned,
Sure.
it's actually so astounding how idiotic you actually are and how delusional you are. You are alongside the fact that you're very unintelligent. You started off with a point about the idea. You can say it in the background, but it's not going to actually help in the rhetoric, right? So we're going to start off with the fact of you saying that these philosophers don't reject evolution, as if
So
that
I'm
was
being really
relevant to
done.
the points I was mentioning. The funny thing is, and you're interrupting again because you know you're getting your back blown out to the conversation. The funny thing is, no one has ever made the point that they deny evolution, nor that you deny evolution. In fact, I stipulated that, assuming that you're not extremely retarded, which all the evidence points towards currently, you would in fact accept evolution. And accepting evolution is going to result in you having a less parsimonious explanation for the explanandum, right? I've explained as to why evolution would actually benefit us. You say that it presupposes psychophysical harmony. You're beneficial for the sake of running. And without that specifically, there are plenty of cases where we would not be able to survive to escape our predators, right? Like how basically in this conversation, right, you're making the claim that this is going to be something which presupposes psychophysical harmony. No, I'm telling you here that these improved biological characteristics, which would include the brain, obviously, which has a sort of causal influence on our phenomenal states and our psychological awareness, is going to be directly beneficial for adaptation and survival, right? And so, of course, it's going to be the case that if psychophysical harmony benefits our survival, which it fucking does, you dumbass retard, as I've explicated on previously, then it would be the case that it follows from this that given the evolution theory or the naturalistic account of the universe, right, which bakes in the evolution theory given the real world facts, this would be expected. And I have no necessity or requirement to even posit any God existed. Of course, not able to understand this. I'm not claiming that you're denying evolution, but rather that you have a less parsimonious interpretation.